search for mortality and neurological outcome. And your starter search strategy can be as simple as that. Take your research question, and if it's structured in PICOs, it turns itself into a search query by just attaching those parentheses, ands, ors, and nots.
Right, that's very interesting. And then off the back of what you get from that search strategy, you might actually discover that your question was too broad. For example, you might discover that there's just so much literature, and you're hitting like the kind of 200,000 papers, and actually the only way you can do anything meaningful is to be a little bit more focused and think more carefully about what the question needs to be if you're going to come up with some sort of reasonable or meaningful answer down the line.
Let's think about expanding and contracting in a second, but I will also note you do want to add in those synonyms, and I put one here. Synonyms are always going to be helpful in, especially in drilling down on papers you might otherwise miss. But let's talk about expanding and contracting reviews. I said that Boolean structures have ands and ors and nots. You use those to expand or contract your query. So you can probably see that if you add an and to a phrase, then that's going to be more constricting, right? So if I have acute ischemic stroke and I add and basilar artery, that means I'm going to get fewer results.
Both criteria have to be met in order for that particular paper to be accepted in the cohort of papers that you're going to find. Yeah.
Correct. And nots actually limit as well. So if you say not your middle cerebral artery, then that would, of course, limit even further by saying, don't give me this type of article. I even find that it's really helpful often to add some nots from the start, like say not before a certain date, not a certain study type.
Yes.
If you can find any of those, because then you don't end up having to review like editorials when you're screening. If you just eliminate them with some good nots. And then if you want to expand things, that's where you're going to be adding those ors. So synonyms or even other therapies that might be comparable, right? If there's a third therapy that can be compared to thrombectomy and thrombolysis, if we add ors, that of course expands how many results are going to come back.
And of course, if you're doing this in PubMed, you can use mesh terms, which are a great way to kind of just, and we won't talk about mesh terms today because I think there's a whole, that's a whole like 20-minute conversation, but there are ways that you can really kind of use technology like mesh terms to identify the synonyms that you might not have otherwise thought of.
If you don't want to get too far into mesh terms, and just for those who aren't PubMed librarians, mesh is basically a structured vocabulary that PubMed uses to map between synonyms. You don't necessarily need to learn them. I just jumped over from my slide deck to our software where I actually build searches. This is our search exploration tool where you can add these terms without having to know Boolean query structure yourself.
That's kind of nice.
And so you can see up here,